I'm just broadcasting the meeting live.
Oh, yeah.
YouTube. And we've had apologies from Simon Bentley, Vanessa Bradley, James Shrine, and Jenny Thorpe.
Excellent, thank you. Forum membership changes, any of those, or nothing to mention?
No changes to mention, Chair.
Thank you. Anybody want to declare any interest in this? No, okay. No changes to the declarations of interest. Let's move on to the minutes from the last meeting, which you've all received and hopefully read.
Just broadcast.
Are we all happy to approve these as a true and accurate record? I take silence for assent. So yes, we are. Thank you. Let's move on to item 4, DSG Monitoring. And it looks like that's Emily that's going to lead on that.
Yes. Hi everyone. So the purpose of this report is to update Schools Forum of the latest monitoring position across the DSG. So the latest position we had at the time of publishing the papers was as at period 8, so that's as at the end of November. We're currently working on the period 9 position, but we'll take you through the key movements from the position that was previously reported to the December forum, which was the period 7 position. So as you can see in the paper, we're currently forecasting an overspend on the DSG of 2.9 million for this financial year. So that's an adverse movement from the prior reported position of £500,000. So you'll see within the paper, the breakdown, the high needs overspend has increased by 100k from the previous month. But again, as we reported last month, there are sort of bigger movements within that make up that 100k. So the biggest pressure by far we're still seeing is the out-of-county independent placements, which we're seeing is driven by volume and price increases. So we're currently working on quantifying the full year effect of those increases, which are largely driven by the September intake, which will obviously have a knock-on impact into the budget next financial year too. And that sort of links into agenda items 7 and 8 as well, which we'll come on to. So the paper, as you'll see, goes on to detail the other variances we're seeing within the high needs block and the movements. However, it's obviously just to bring Schools Forum's attention to the key driver of the pressure that we're seeing in the high needs block there. You'll also note that the other movement we're seeing this month is an increase in the overspend forecast in the early years block. And again, this links to increased demand in numbers, particularly in relation to requests for high needs there. So currently the forecast overspend there and movement is 0.4 million, and we're keeping a close eye on that sort of for the rest of this financial year as well, and doing more work and more analysis. So just to round off then, for completeness, we're forecasting nil variance currently in the schools and central schools services block. So that basically is the position as we're currently forecasting. So I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Emily. Anybody got any questions on Emily's report, either a verbal report or the paper?
I've got a question, please, Chair.
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Emily. Just really following on from, you may recall from the previous forum, I'd asked Chris regarding, from a mainstream perspective, the potential impacts that any deficits will have on future school budgets. So we're aware of the options that were agreed in the previous forum. And the way things are looking, you said one of the reasons for the significant overspend was the intake in numbers in September. And therefore the question would be, are you anticipating a very similar problem in September 22? And therefore, what is going to be the impact on mainstream school budgets this time next year, are we going to be asked to, my school, as an example, is down £22,000. I know that other schools have lost significantly more. So my question really from mainstream colleagues is that, are we going to be in a position where we are going to be asked to pick one of these options and have an impact on our budget based on what we currently know and potentially what we know regarding intake for September 22 regarding SEND sector?
Right. Emily, do you want to take any of that? Do you want me to?
So I think we've projected as far as possible using the current data in terms of it, in particular, the biggest pressure around the independent placements, which are out of county, which accounts for the key pressure. But that's obviously as a result of not being able to place within county. And I think Chris's recovery plan sort of addresses some of those things. But in terms of sort of our projections going forwards, we're obviously still in a bit of a stabilisation period for West Northants. So our projections in the budget for next financial year, which as a sort of major reference to links into agenda item 7, we've sort of gone with the best projections on sort of full year effect and growth,
right,
which we're sort of taking from this financial year going forwards.
So Emily, if I can take over from there, I think the essence of the question is, do the significant issues and the growth in the deficit budget in the high needs block impact adversely on mainstream school budgets? Is that broadly what the concern line behind the question is?
And we understand that's the decision that's been taken from Forum this year in terms of the impact on school budget moving forward for the new financial year. But are we going to be in a position to that this is almost going to be the situation next year?
Well, yeah. So in terms of the disapplication we want to make, I made it clear this year that we believe that schools should be paying for services that schools have a funding for, which is the specialist services. Mm-hmm. So it is the intention every year to ask for that, even though the ESFA may overturn it. Or if not, ask for the 0.5% towards the deficit. So that will reoccur. But there will be no more calls on schools for the high needs budget, to support the high needs budget. The local authority needs to resolve this through the action plan that I'll outline later in the agenda. Is that something of an answer for you?
Yeah, I guess there's later reference, isn't there, in agenda item 7, I believe, that we begin to look at the increase in provision. And I guess in part, the follow-up question at that point that I would be probably saying is kind of timeframes around that. And I know that you've set that out within roles and responsibilities. So I guess we'll cover some of this in agenda item.
Yeah, I'm very happy to answer all your questions in relation to that item, which is, it's really important that Schools Forum is kept fully on board of the issues that we have and the action plan for the authorities to tackle it. So I appreciate the question.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions to Emily on her report? Oh, okay. Thank you, Emily. Let's move on to item 5, which is West Northants Council Schools budget update on the final DSG settlement from, I think Beth is going to speak on this one.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. Thank you. I haven't put the report up on screen, so I'll just assume that you can all see it. This is to update you on the final settlement that we got just before Christmas and to let you know how that impacts on our modelling for the schools' budgets. The appendix shows school by school the currently indicative still until we have this submitted and signed off by the ESFA, which usually happens in February. And as Chris mentioned, we're also still waiting for the outcome of our disapplication request to the Minister to go for the 0.68% rather than the usual 0.5% high needs block move. So we had, first of all, the usual DSG update, which finalises the schools block, high needs block and central school services block. The early years block is still indicative because we don't get the final on that until July 2023. We've got an increase, a significant increase, but in addition to that DSG that was announced in the usual statement on the government website, there was a supplementary schools grant issued at the same time, which isn't rolled into that usual statement that we see. So that was some great news that we had before Christmas. The way that that's going to be distributed will be given to us as allocations specific per school for the schools block extra supplementary grant, but then for the high needs block extra grant that they announced, which was 2 million on top of the 4.7 million increase. That's for us as a council to distribute, but it is also there to recognise the same purposes as the supplementary in the schools block, which is for the national insurance increase and other sort of inflationary increases. So the paper talks about the background to the schools block consultation and the decisions that we made at the last December Schools Forum, where we looked at setting the dedelegations and the growth fund budget and policy, changes to pupil numbers for new and growing schools, and central expenditure from the school central services block. And in addition, we also set the permanent exclusion clawback policy and the split site funding policy. So then to give a bit of background to how the funding has been given to us, we start with a provisional announcement in July, and from that we did our modelling that we brought to you in between October and December for the consultation for the mainstream schools. Then on Thursday, 16th of December, we had the final DSG and also the additional supplementary. So there's a table 2 within the document shows how each of the blocks has moved between those 3 announcements, from the provisional to the DSG and then also including the supplementary for 22-23. So you'll see overall we've got a 10.6 million supplementary increase for 22-23. So what does that mean for the schools modelling that we produced? Generally, it means that we're in a good position. We've managed to afford the national fund to follow the national formula. There's the 2% increase per pupil funding between the 2 years. We've managed to afford the minimum per pupil funding levels, which are at 1,265 per pupil for primary school, and then 5,321 for Key Stage 3 and 5,831 per Key Stage 4 pupil. Within that, we've seen the increase in support for the small and remote schools with the scarcity factor, which has increased the funding for primary schools by up to 55,000, up to 80,000 for secondary schools. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. So then showing you the primary unit of funding and the secondary unit of funding, the PUF and the SUF, which is the funding rates that we receive in our formula to then distribute through, in addition to the PUF and SUF, which is the per unit level, per child level from the October census. There's also the premises factor, the PFI, the rates and the split sites. And we have a difference in the way that we're funded for rates this year. The government taking the rates funding off our DSG, and instead of us distributing it to the schools, we just send the bills to the government and they pay it directly and top slice the DSG. So that's a significant change for 22.
Sorry, Beth, I don't know whether other people are finding it, but you're going a bit faint.
Sorry, I'm actually losing my voice.
Oh no, I'm sorry.
Speak up a bit. So it's just they're talking about the change in the rates and the way that the in prior years we've forwarded the rates budget to schools and then invoiced schools for that. Well, the billing authority has, but we're now the billing and precepting authority combined as a unitary. But there's a general national change in the way that the rates are taken, which is that we submit the bills to the government, and they top slice the DSG for that rate bill. So we won't be forwarding that part of the school's budgets to schools and then invoicing them. I've talked about the supplementary funding. The high needs block increase represents the authority's share of the 780 million national increase. So our block was initially announced as the 4.7 million, which is at the minimum guaranteed increase of 8%. And then in addition, there was the 2 million supplementary. As discussed in the previous item and in this one earlier, we're not seeking to transfer 0.5%. We're looking for 0.68%, and we're awaiting the outcome of the ministerial disapplication. Central School Services block, we have the usual small increase on the ongoing responsibilities, which have salaries funded from them. So that, and also the copyright licenses, which increase, and we don't have any sort of power to change those. So they're ongoing responsibilities, and the government has increased the fund for those by 110,000. The historical part of the Central School Services block is being unwound and decreased by 20% each year. And so for 22-23, we're seeing a decrease of £550,000. So that's something that we've forecast and we have built into our medium-term revenue plan. And there won't be any loss of services, but the general fund will be picking up some additional costs in the medium-term financial plan for that. There will come a point at which we have to talk to the ESFA because from that historical fund, historical teachers' pensions and a PFI is funded from that pre-2013 costs, which we obviously can't go below. So there'll be a discussion within 22-23 with the government about the reducing historical block in the central block. So the final block to talk about is the early years block. This doesn't get finalised until after the 22-23 financial year has finished. And it's been through a number of changes in how it's funded over the last 3 years because of COVID. In a normal year, it's funded based on the January census preceding the financial year's start in April for the first 5 months. And then the January within the financial year, that funds, that census drives the funding for the final 7 months. That last happened in 1920, and it's proposed that that will be the same way it's funded in 22-23. The first year of COVID impact, the funding was swapped to a 9 months and then 3 months version. And in this year, it's on payments data from the 3 blocks, funding blocks, kind of aligned to a school term, but they're called blocks in early years sector. The rest of this report gives you the increases in our base rates that we're receiving and how that affects our funding. We won't fully know until we know the outcome of how this year's funding has changed. We're expecting an announcement from the government soon to show what the autumn 2021 and the spring 2022 funding submissions that we've done translate into funding. And so from that point, we'll be able to understand more what these changes mean for us. But there's been an increase of 21p in the base rate for 2-year-olds and an increase of 17p for 3- and 4-year-old hourly base rate for universal and extended funding. It's probably worth noting that from that 3- and 4-year-old funding pot also comes the central funding for the administration of early years, which within this block is allowed to be 5%, and also other supplements like deprivation would be funded from that single 3- and 4-year-old part of the funding. So there's a table there which presents those changes for you. And there are also increases in the early years pupil premium of 7p per hour. Disability Access Fund is an annual lump sum, and that's per pupil that's eligible, and that's increased by £185 per annum. And the Maintain Nursery Settings Protection per hour has a 3% increase, which is the first year that we've seen that since the changes were introduced and that supplement was formed. So the key changes I've discussed earlier are the increase in the sparsity rates and the broadening of the tapering to include more schools, and also an increase of by approximately 3% on the basic entitlement and per pupil formula factors. The financial implications, there's a summary there, just showing the different block increases and the difference between 21-22 current year and the 22-23 final budgets as discussed. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you for coping with losing your voice as well. We'll try and restrict what you have to say on the future items if we can. Any questions on that report?
Paul Wheeler has his hand up, Chair.
Sorry. Who has their hand up? Sorry.
Paul Wheeler.
I do, Peter.
Sorry. Yeah. Hello. Hi, Paul. Yes.
I know we'll probably keep coming back to it during the meeting, but it's a question probably more around Chris on the high needs. When you look at the increase in funding this year, high needs has got 12.4% increase, and also harking back to the question forum colleagues asked previously, there has to be a point where high needs starts managing within the budgets that are set and not requiring a subsidy from schools block. So given the 12.4% increase from the prior year, if that continues, or we continue to get higher needs additional funding, at what point are we going to be able to stop funding it out of the main schools block?
Chris,
You're on mute.
You're on mute, Chris.
I didn't know I was back on mute. I beg your pardon. I will answer that in under item 7, but I will offer a brief answer to this now. First of all, I think our basic increase, my understanding, Beth, was it was actually on the lowest end, which is 8%, and other elements of that must be inflation. But I thought the real terms was 8%. Irrespective, it's an above inflation amount, and if it continues that we have above inflation amounts of government supporting the high needs block, it will definitely support a reduction to 0, and schools not being asked to contribute the 0.5%. It won't in the future prevent us asking schools to fund services for which they're funded, which is the specialist services. But the main issue in the country, and not in, I want to emphasise, although we're not managing our budget within the amount allocated, we're at the lower end of councils overspending in England. The upper end is, as you'll see, in the realms of 70-80%, or it was before government help. We will have the ability to reduce it to 0 or close to 0 by mid this century, only if we succeed in all elements of the action plan that I've set out in item 7. But 70% of that action plan will depend on places that we provide in the state sector to reduce our dependence on the independent schools. It's about 70% more per place in an independent school than it is in the state sector, and that will reduce our expenditure. If we reduce the number of places that I'm proposing to council members, it will reduce the overspend by about £4 million. And the rest of it will be through the other actions. So yes, we do intend to reduce this to net 0, but not before about 4 or 5 years, and not before we agree with schools that they will pay for services for which they're funded.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. I think I saw, sorry, I'm struggling to see hands up. I think I saw Lindsay's hand up.
Yes,
Sorry.
yes. Yeah, just a couple of questions. Beth, you'll probably be able to answer them. The supplementary funding that was mentioned, the 1.2 billion national funding, is that eligible for nursery schools as registered schools?
There is some going to maintain nursery schools for the national insurance increase. There's a document on gov.uk. If you do a search, it gives you the details on there. Less for maintained nursery schools than secondary, but there is some.
Okay, thank you. And then the other question I had was just where it mentions about the early years, high needs pressures from the early years and not jointly funding the early years SEND children in nursery provision and what that means for the early years sector.
Beth, do you want me to answer that?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah, it has no implication whatever for the nursery sector, and I'll come on to that in the high needs block report. Lindsay, what's happened today? This is entirely down to me. Kelly's made representations, everybody else, and I've kind of swept them aside. I'm not satisfied that the budget that we'd set aside for early years is the right one. Whether or not we have a budget is actually irrelevant because we must meet need. So you don't need a specific budget to meet need because it's all overspending anyway within the high needs block at the moment, all of it. I want to be assured that all our settings are using their nominal funding for SEN before we get anything. As soon as a setting can show us that they've exceeded their nominal funding, we will ensure that they're given the funding that they need through the high needs block. But it will be done through a pure overspend without a budget. And then in the next year, 2023-24, my successor, my substantive successor, will actually allocate a budget, which will be based on an accurate representation of what the need is likely to be.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. Thanks.
Any other questions to Beth on her report? No, I don't think so. Can't see anybody. Okay, we're going to move on to item 6 now, which is the disapplication request. And an update, and again it says Beth here, but I think do you want to update us briefly because I'm aware of your voice?
Thank you. Yeah, it's really following a request by Will, our ESFA member, to make it really clear that if the disapplication for 0.68% isn't accepted, that the schools forum do want to proceed with a 0.5% top size that we normally do, and to take a formal vote on that. I think it was discussed and not specifically voted on in December. So we need to take a formal vote.
Yeah. Okay, so what we're voting on is just that we go for 0.5 if the ESFA don't let us go for 0.61.
68,
yes.
Yeah.
68, whatever it was, yeah.
Yes, Peter, that's exactly right. And if I could add, we're still making very strong representations because Schools Forum did agree it, and it has a form of logic. But they're very tough on local authorities doing this, which we knew when we were entering it. Okay. So Schools Forum has done its absolute best and has been supportive as you possibly can, but it's now in the hands of the ESFA. Obviously, if we don't get that, we will fund the specialist services partly and not fully. In other words, they cost 2.1 million. We'll be getting 1.5 million towards those services and not 2.1 million. And the local authority will have to accommodate that with increased overspend in the high needs block, which we're currently trying to balance.
So let's just take a vote on that then.
Yeah.
Are we?
Chair, sorry, before you do, can I just, we've been asked on a number of occasions to provide the number of people voting for, against or abstaining. So would you entertain me doing a quick roll call for the vote? Is that okay? It won't take long.
That's fine, yeah. Do a roll call.
So if members could just indicate verbally if they're for, against or abstain. John Lake.
For.
Thank you. Eliza Hollis.
For.
Thank you. Dan York.
For.
Thank you. Lindsay Barnett.
Do I get to vote from a nursery school on this one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. We can vote on that. Thank you. Lee Hughes.
For.
Thank you. Simon Bentley's, I've got apologies. Ian Massey, I can't see, is here. Paul Wheeler.
For.
Thank you. Sandra Appleby, Nikki Lamond and Rod Warsap, I can't see her here unless they've joined without me noticing? No. And I've had apologies from Vanessa Bradley. So Karen Lewis.
4.
Thank you. James Shrine's given apologies. Jenny Thorpe's given apologies. Rachel Martin.
Yeah, 4.
Thank you. Hayley Walker.
4.
And Peter French.
Yes, I'm always reluctant to vote as chair, but I will say 4.
Okay, so everyone who's present, that's 10 for, no, none against and no abstentions, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody.
Thank you. We'll now move on to item 7, which is the high needs budget, which we've been talking about. Is there? I'm just aware of Beth's voice. Are you?
It's me. It's me, Chair.
You, is it, Chris?
Yeah. This is actually my report. My principle is the person that writes the report should present it. So Beth and Emily do the ones that they've written, and I do the ones that I write.
Sorry, Chris. There were 2 reports called High Needs. One is just a quick update on what the High Needs budget will look like, and then your recovery plan as well.
Oh yeah, sorry, that's item 8. No, sorry, Peter, you're right. This is Beth very briefly, and then item 8.
So I was just going to say, Beth, we've got. I think we've got the papers. So just be as brief as you want to be. That's what I wanted to say.
It's really just for information. There isn't an awful lot to say. I've updated on the DSG settlement. So really, it's just for information to see what our budget sort of process has been. It's kind of an incremental rather than a zero-based budget exercise. We've started with 21-22's position. We've looked at the monitoring and what that's suggesting for the outturn and added those changes onto it. And then the other increases, we're sort of looking at the full year impact of growth that's happened within 21-22, as we know that once those places are taken by children for the 7 months, that turns into a 12-month budget increase for next year. We've got the inflationary increases in salaries. We know the national insurance increase. And then there's obviously an estimate of new growth added in. So that's how we've arrived at our estimate of the budgets we need. And we also have, again, another line in there to try and to pay the prior year deficit that we're forecasting from this current year. And also unusually this year, I've brought the special school budgets in an appendix. It's indicative at the moment. I'm not expecting it to change drastically, and that's really for them to have the information as early as possible. I think that's about it.
Okay, thank you. Anybody want to ask anything on that? It's not for voting, it's just for information. I can't see any hands up, so thank you very much, Beth. Chris, now's your chance.
Yeah, okay.
Recovery plan.
Which I'm going to take. Chair, I'm not going to go through this in any detail because all members have had the plan, but I will go through it just very briefly and starting with what the recommendation with. You may or may not recall that last time I did ask Schools Forum members whether they wanted regular reports to Schools Forum or a specialist subgroup, which Schools Forum can determine to report back regularly to Schools Forum on local authority progress with tackling the deficit. It is obviously part of the DSG, and I think the local authority should be accountable in part. It's accountable to its members because it's a local authority budget, but also to be monitored by Schools Forum members, because of course Schools Forum does vote money or doesn't in maybe a future case to support the high needs block. Now that rather, because we were voting on crucial matters about next year's budget, it kind of got lost and there wasn't really any vote about it. So I consulted the lead member, Councillor Baker, and other colleagues and my boss, the Director of Children's Services, to say, look, should I write an initial report to Schools Forum saying exactly what the position we're in is and why it is, and then ask Schools Forum in the at the end of the report how it wished to carry this forward, whether it just wanted occasional reports, whether it wanted a subgroup, whether it wanted a report to every meeting, and whatever you want to see, we'll do it. So that's what the recommendation is. In terms of the report itself, it reports on the current position of the high needs budget. It reports on the high needs block recovery plan and what we intend to do in that plan. The elements of the plan that you've got there are a spreadsheet which contains our estimates of where we will be in the last few years. I'm going to go through that. And then there's another report, which I didn't necessarily think you wanted that amount of detail, but in the spirit of openness, it contains an action plan that I've written that has 8 elements within it, all led by an officer, all red, amber, green in terms of our progress against them. All of these actions will contribute in one way or another to the block, to the reduction in the high needs block. But some are more important than others, notably resource provision and special school numbers. And so to go through to the spreadsheet, now the spreadsheet is slightly complicated because I noticed I sent a spreadsheet with several tabs, only intending that the first tab was used, but you've got all the other tabs in there, which is fine. I haven't populated them yet, but what you need is the first tab, which is called the high needs block saving proposals 2022 to 2026. So if everybody's got that in front of them, what you'll see is there are 18 lines in that on the left. And then on line 3, there's a bracketed 1 down to bracketed 8, which is on line 10. Those are the actual tasks in the action plan, which is a list of tasks that are in the Word document that you've got that I'm not going to go through. Each one of those has a lead officer, which is in the 3rd column. And then you've got a load of financial columns, and I'm going to go through these as briefly as I can. Row number 1 is the amount of money that is the overspend from the previous year. Now, you'll notice that that's naught for the current end of beginning of year, because it was all zeroed out with money that Northamptonshire County Council had in contingencies. So although there was a structural deficit that year, that was wiped out. But because we haven't addressed the structural deficit, exactly that amount, in fact, that's out of date, of course, because it's more than that now, that reoccurs. And because it reoccurs, you put that every single year. So you can see in 2022, 2023, because whatever you recover, we would need to recover 2.5 million in underspend in order to address that next year. And then we need to do it again, and then we need to do it again. So in order to make progress in any underspend, we have to attain a saving of more than 2.5 million every year. And what you'll notice there, in terms of this year, it's naught in terms of the savings that we've got against the plan. So we now get down to line 7, the bold line 7, which has a saving of 2.1 million for the specialist services next year. Of course, that may not occur if the ESFA don't agree it, and I will have to amend the spreadsheet. It will mean a £600,000 plus over expenditure. You look at the funding of AP places, that's not finalised yet, but we don't need as many AP places in primary and secondary. And we've reached agreement with the primary about reduced places. We've suggested to the ESFA a number that we need to commission next year in terms of secondary. And I've assumed the part year saving next year because it's from September, and the full year saving in the years that go on from that. And then we've got independent schools, where I believe if we get a specialist member to go around independent schools, there are potential small savings, not major savings, because we're still short of placements. But there are things that we could do about agreements that there are often very expensive things in place that we can reduce. So I've assumed a nominal amount of savings there. Then you've got the savings estimate in bold on line 11. And then you've got the disapplication of the 0.5%. Now, that's a negative figure because we're not asking for it, but we did ask for it in previous years. So if we asked for it then and we didn't ask for it now, it's a negative figure. So with that 2.1 million, in fact, it doesn't get us anywhere because we've got 1.5 million not asking for, and we've also got expenditure that's outside the high needs block in the council's budget that has been zeroed out and taken from saving. So we've got a zero saving there. Then you look at the disapplication savings, and it's 924,000. Then you look at the ceasing the high needs payments to the early years block. That's because I assume the budget was over £500,000, but I assume if we're tougher on making sure that all the earlier settings are using their nominal budgets, I think our expenditure will be lower. So I put an amount there. And then you've got a closing deficit or surplus, which is 1.4. then you have to add that on in the line above in 2023, because although we've achieved a saving, we haven't achieved 2.5 million. So it's 1.4 million. Then you've got the structural budget, of course, of 2.5 million, which carries on. And that results, I'm not going to go through every line again. What that means is every year at the moment, the deficit increases. And you'll see it's up to 8.5 million by 2025-26. That is before we've taken mitigated action beyond the lines that we have. And the big ticket item is places in the state sector that replace expensive independent provision. We've made a really good start with that, which is that we've reached agreement with a number of schools for about 100 resource places. That will reduce the overall expenditure. It'll be a cost avoidance. Then we've got another 120 places where schools have agreed, but we haven't got the capital money. And I'm starting the process next week in the council of prudential borrowing to get that amount of money. Then the really big ticket item is we need 250 more places in a special school or big specialist provision. The cost of that is potentially huge, up to 19 million. And there is no government money for this, so the council would have to borrow it. And that is a really big deal for the council. And it may well result in the council coming back to schools forum and saying, we need a bit of help with the repayments of this capital budget. It benefits all in the system, and we want to ask you for some help. We're a long way off that yet. The reason is that I'm in discussions with a trust about potential use of buildings that we already have that would accommodate that number of pupils with much lower capital expenditure, which would be much more affordable, but would lead to around about the 500 places we believe we'll need, first of all, in the future for additional SEN, and secondly, to reduce the dependence on independent places. I've estimated the cost avoidance of that being 4.5 to 5 million. And if we manage to produce more places through more cooperation with schools, that cost avoidance will rise. Another advantage that we have here is that some of our independent schools are actually quite weak. Their provision isn't as good as it is in state schools, special schools and mainstream schools with resource provision or in mainstream. And therefore, we've got a better chance of persuading parents to come back to a state school from an independent school. So in other words, we may avoid costs much quicker than you would do in a sort of normal scenario. So that's the situation that we're in at the moment. What you're asked to do is receive this report, comment and question me about it, and then determine between yourselves what information you would like from me and when in future, and whether you would like the bulk of work of holding me to account, holding the council to account for this, to occur in a specialist subgroup, or for this to come back to one or more meetings of schools forum. That's it from me, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So can we'll hold the decision about where we want to receive these reports, but we'll just, first of all, is there any questions from anybody on Chris's reports? Yes, John's got a question.
Hi, Chris. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, just to understand, Chris, have we got any indication at this stage when we will hear back from the ESFA regarding the disapplication?
Next 2 weeks, it should be. The ESFA should be here, so I'd like them to give information about that. But they would need to do that in order. Sorry,
I am actually here, Chris. Hello. Yeah, you're right. It should be within the next couple of weeks. You should hear back. The submission for the decisions is currently with Minister Walker for review, so we should hopefully hear back from him shortly.
Just to ask, Will, while you're there, is there any precedent for this?
It's similar to things we've seen before. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar. So we've reviewed it in a panel. We've taken into consideration all of the factors, including, and not least, of course, the decision of the schools forum. Yeah. So we've put that in and we've sent that to the Minister for his consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Just as a value added to that question, I will say that the adjudication that's come from the ESFA have been disappointing to quite a large number of authorities.
I'm sure that's been heard. Daniel, have you got a question?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Chris, just to pick up on your point regarding the measures that you're putting into place, you mentioned regarding resource provision as almost the immediate action leading up to September. You mentioned around the capital. Are you assured in terms of the amount of capital that the authority has to fund those resources provisions, and therefore that would be a step that's taken in a shorter period of time as opposed to over a longer period of time of a special school at £19 million?
Yeah, so this is, I'll be completely open with you about the amount of money that we have and the amount of money we know we need at the moment. So with schools have been brilliant here in terms of their discussions with us about resource provision. So if we can pay the capital, and obviously we have to, schools can't possibly do it, and it's our responsibility. We've got the go ahead, and we could do a lot of these places by September 2022, get them in place immediately. And with a slight delay in funding, certainly 2023, we could deliver the whole thing. To start, of course, you don't get all of the pupils in place. We want to accelerate a number of year groups, but you don't get all the year groups in at once. But at the moment, we've got 3 million of an estimated 6.5 to 7 million that we need in terms of capital. And that's obviously something I'm discussing with the Director of Finance and members about prudential borrowing, because the council's got a lot of prudential borrowing for housing and other things, and this will be put in as a part of that. Now, the special school has obviously got to be different because it's a much larger amount of money. But in actual fact, because we have got schools with land, with whom I'm in discussion at the moment, the amount of money needed, the gap between the lower amount and the higher amount is huge. So the very upper amount is 19 million, but the lower amount is 6 or 7 million. If you've got an existing building and you might need to extend and adapt that building and you've got land, the cost reduces significantly. And there is that possibility. Now, if there is that possibility, it is much more amenable to the council to borrow that money. And I'm reasonably optimistic at the moment. I'm writing to that trust more or less as we speak about the various options we've got with the specialist provision on the site. And all I can say is they're very, very good discussions that I've been having. I would just add the schools here, in terms of, being open to resource provision, considering the relatively low level of inclusion, I've been stunned about how good it's been and how open schools have been to this. It's been really heartwarming. Chris Wickens and Anthony Giles have been round to about 20 schools. And so I commend all the schools, and some of them, obviously the head teachers and trust chief execs, are going to be in this meeting.
Yeah, thank you. I do know a couple of the schools you're talking about. I mean, what I was going to add to the conversation, and I know there's a couple of people with their hands up, but I was just going to add to the conversation that I think the other thing, as well as talking about capital money, which is obviously really important, I actually think that schools that are anxious to provide alternative provision will actually do a better job than some of the providers you've got now, because if they're committed to it, that will make a huge difference, and that may help your conversation with the council. I don't know. Yes,
that's absolutely right.
Karen, you've got your virtual hand up.
Thank you. I'm totally committed to resource provision because hopefully it would have a positive impact on our school and reduce tribunals, which are costly. But I'm just wondering, what would be the criteria and level of need? And actually, what would be the admission procedure for having a place in a resource provision? And does it cover both secondary and primary? Because currently we have many primary resource provision, and we often struggle then at secondary in specialist schools having space. So what's the admission criteria, and is the provision for both primary and secondary?
Right. So on admissions criteria, obviously pupils with SEN within the HCP are number one on admissions, so they go in first. We would generally be allocating these pupils who have an EHCP. There's parental preference, but we would work with the parent, and they would go in on that basis. In terms of there would be some term type admissions at first, and we will be allocating the pupils based on parental preference and address. With the point about,
so can I just ask? I totally take on board the EHCP, but actually the continuum of need with an EHCP is quite wide. So is this going to be for those that you know don't necessarily need a specialist school provision? Do we know the sort of the severity of need? Has that been
right? Okay, so that's quite a difficult one to answer, and I want to be as brief as I can. It is resource provision is for pupils with a high level of need who have got an EHCP, but are who cannot be in a class of 30. We would expect most pupils with EHCPs to be able to manage a class of 30 with support. But resource provision is the first stage of those that can't. There's a but there. There are some pupils who are currently in special schools, in my view, that should not be. And they're there because we haven't got sufficient places in mainstream schools and in resource provision. So I'd expect pupils to come back or not to go to special schools who would have previously gone. So that doesn't mean they're at a very high level of need. It means that their needs could only be met in a special because of the lack of resource provision. So it wouldn't be a higher level of need, really, but it will be a higher level of need that are generally in primary and secondary schools at the moment. That's my answer to that. And then in terms of secondary, you've hit the nail right, absolutely on the head. You always get a lower proportion of pupils in secondaries with EHCPs than in mainstream and resource, partly because parents are worried about their children surviving in a bigger secondary as against a primary. So there's always, the wrong word, wastage between the two. You always get a smaller number, and therefore you need a slightly smaller number of places. In West Northamptonshire, that's artificial because more parents want their children to remain in mainstream than we have places. And so a larger number of our proposed places are in secondary than primary at the moment. And so it will make the ability of parents to make a preference for secondary schools in future rather than specialist provision, either in the state sector or independent. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's because that's the pinch point for us, moving from a resource provision from primary and not having anything at secondary.
It is. It absolutely is.
Thank you. I think Councillor Baker has a virtual hand up.
Sorry, yes. I just wanted to assure you that Chris and I have had many conversations on this and how we address the problem that we're facing, because all of those of you in schools will be fully aware, like I am, that this is not an issue that is going to disappear. Following on from all the COVID problems has added more children to the list, and this is going to be a growing issue. So just to tell you that from the council point of view as members, I will be supporting Chris with this request to council. We have looked at it in all sorts of ways in order to be able to present it in a way that we think will work for the council to take on this project in the way that we want it. And as Chris knows, from the minute I met him, I spoke about our need in the West for a special school. There are some children that cannot cope in the normal mainstream, but there are others that with a lot of help and some other guidance could manage and could be integrated more in the neighbourhood that they live in. So those are my I just wanted to, I know I'm not part of this and only an observer, but I thought useful for you to know my view on it as well.
That's very encouraging. That's very encouraging. So hopefully things will progress. Any more questions on the report? Okay, let's go to how we want to hear about this further. So Chris has suggested either a working party or regular reports back to us as forum. Do people have a preference at all?
I think because Chris will be leaving us eventually, my query will be around who's going to be driving this once you leave. So I think forum, I know from my personal view, I would like it to come back to forum so that we can really drive this with you, because obviously you're not going to be there to ensure that this vision comes to fruition. That's my point of view.
Yes.
Shall
Chair, can I just answer that before the other questions?
Yeah.
I always say, because I've been an interim for quite some time, my job as an interim is to make a difference long beyond my tenure. And there will be an AD for education that comes into post. The templates are there. The political expectation is there that this work continues. And there will need to be the appointment of somebody with the capability of driving this forward, with the knowledge and the sympathy for STM.
John?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. All I'd like to do is just to add to what Eliza's already said. I think this is a really live issue for us and has been for quite a number of years. So I think it's important that it comes back to forum, really.
Okay.
Paul?
Yes, I agree. As John has just said, it has been a hot topic for forum for a number of years, and I think that it would be better coming back a report to full forum and have discussion there.
Right. I think you've got your answer, Chris. I think
yes.
We'll take it back to full forum, and I think I concur with that as well.
Yeah, okay. What I'll agree with you, Chair, is it may be, because there's only 5 meetings a year, it comes back to each one. But if nothing's changed, then we might skip one.
Yeah,
not to avoid any, if nothing's changed, I just say nothing's changed.
There's no point having a report for report's sake.
No, absolutely. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the early years budget. Now, I am aware that Lindsay, I think, has asked to speak on this as well. So I'm going to just ask Beth or Kelly to say a few words about it first, and then I will bring Lindsay in first and then anybody else afterwards, if that's okay.
There are sort of 2 parts to this. There's the main non-MNS consultation, which does also apply to MNS, which Kelly's going to take, and then we can come back to the maintain nursery setting specific consultation, please.
Okay, Kelly first then.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, everyone. So the purpose of this report was to feed back to you with regards to the consultation that we ran. It was a very short timescale. It was released on the 24th of December and it closed on the 14th of January. We did 2 reminders and 2 resends in that time just to make sure we could capture as many as possible. Hopefully you'll have all seen from the report that the questions are in there, the responses are in there, and the comments that we've had. I'll just touch on a few highlights. So of the 506 providers we have in the West, we had 26 responses. I'm going to read this because I can't remember it off by heart. So, do you support the LA's proposed to add 13p to the base rate? We had yes at 20, no at 5, and 1 failed to respond. The comments were mainly around people thinking that the hourly rate should be higher, thinking that we should put more money onto that base rate where possible, and that the theme that is going through there talks about the cost of living and minimum wage. Question 2 was around 2-year-olds and the proposal to add 19p to the 2-year-old base rate. Out of the 25, we had 21 yes, 4 no, and a failure to respond. The comments were, again, want the base rate to be higher where possible. The final question was around notional send and the proposal to increase the notional send from 8p to 14p. We had 23 a yes and 2 no's, and the comments were mainly around possible other options that we could do as a local authority that would support children with special educational needs. We are looking at other options for special educational needs as part of early years high needs that Chris touched on earlier on. So the summary, it was short and sweet. We had as many responses as we possibly could. As I say, we did many chases and updates to sending out the information to make sure. I just have one final request for a vote on the paper that I put through. Is Beth, do you want to pick up on the 5%?
I think we've asked for votes on this early years formula for information, but then there's also the deciding vote from Schools Forum on the central funding, which is how it is for most blocks.
Yeah.
The actual deciding vote on the 5% central for administration of early years is the deciding vote, but we've also asked for full votes. I think.
Yes.
Paul's got those.
Sorry, I'm bare little brain. I'm a bit confused.
We have the early years funding formula, which is within the consultation that was discussed in December. We've gone out to consultation. So those are the results that Kelly's summarised. So then we're asking Schools Forum to vote on those proposals, which is for information, except for the one vote on 5% central.
Right.
Funding, which is
so are we just voting on the 5% thing, or are we voting on all the other bits as well? That's what I'm about. Sorry.
The consultation responses were purely for information, Chair. The vote is for the 5%.
5%. Fine, that's fine. Thank you. Now, do you want, Beth, do you want to do your bit now, and then I'll ask, or sorry, I'll go backwards. Lindsay, did you want to come in response to that, or in response to the next part of it?
The next part.
The next part, that's fine. So I'll just check whether there's any questions on the consultation bit first. Rachel has her hand up.
Hiya. I had asked last meeting about some clarification on why the central expenditure has gone up to, was it 3.5 to 5% now? It's not always, it wasn't 5% last year, the central expenditure, was it?
Yeah, last year it was the year before that wasn't. Beth, have I got that the right way round?
You're on mute.
You're on mute, Beth.
Maybe I'm a year out. Probably me.
Yeah, I think it was pretty close to 5% for 21-22. Might not have been exact, but it's pretty close to. It's not as low as 3.5. That was and in the year it was that low. I think Andrew Cadman was with us.
Yes, that's right.
He took another proposal. He was the early years head of early years then.
So what was it last year, Beth?
Proposal to increase it. That was the prior year.
What was it last year? Sorry, was it 5% last year?
When you say last year, 2021, or this year, 21-22?
Sorry, yeah, this year.
I'll double check it, but I think it's close to 5% this year.
So my difficulties, as I spoke sort of last at last forum, is around sort of the central expenditure rising again and services still being reduced. We're not having sort of the same support and training being offered. So I'm assuming it's all around the sort of increases for national insurance and things like that coming ahead in the future. But I just wondered when we're having a service reduction, then your central expenditure is being increased as well.
With those points for you, Rachel. The service that was early years. Sorry. The service that was early years was split into two in April. So you've got the funding and business compliance service, and you've got the advisory and training service. The early years advisory and training service now sits under school effectiveness. So that it's under Katie Morledge for the West and Joe Hutchinson for the North. So the additional monies that would be coming into central from a funding and business compliance point of view, I would look at increasing the provider portal and putting the 2-year-old checker into the provider portal, so it would benefit the sector. With regards to training and advisory, it would be up to Katie how she chose to utilise that funding within her service.
Right, okay.
I'll just support that. We've said for years in terms of how that money's spent in terms of what's passported to the sector and how that 5% is used centrally, because obviously you can see the strain on the early years sector and how much they're struggling.
Thank you, Kelly.
Sorry, just so I'm clear about this now. So Beth, are you now talking about the 5%, or are you talking about something else now?
This is the 5% central funding that Schools Forum need to vote on.
Yeah, and is that your contribution to this item?
No, that's there's a separate maintain nursery setting specific consultation that we need
right,
to
okay.
well, yeah.
So are we ready? Is there anybody else that wants to comment on this, on the 5%? Let's do that now. No, okay. So we have Forum have to vote for the 5% increase.
Yeah, Chairman, if you're happy, I'll take a quick roll call again because this is a binding.
Yeah, okay. So, but do we all vote, or is there limited people that vote?
Yes, everyone votes on the central. When we take the indicative vote on the formula, then only you would be excluded from that, Chair.
Oh.
So the non-school members can't vote, but the PVI provider representatives who are non-schools members can vote. There's an exception. So I'll take the vote now. So for, against, or abstain on the 5%. John Lake.
For.
Thank you. Eliza Hollis.
For.
Thank you. Dan York. For. I won't read out the names of the people that aren't here. Lindsay Barnett.
Against.
Okay. Lee Hughes.
For.
Paul Wheeler.
For.
Karen Lewis.
I think I'll abstain. I need to I don't really understand it fully, the wider implications.
Okay, thank you. Rachel Martin.
Against.
Hayley Walker.
Against.
And Peter French.
Yeah, I'm going to abstain because I'm with Fiona. I just don't understand it. I'm sorry.
Okay, so Chairman, I've got 5 votes for, 3 against, and 2 abstentions. So any members I haven't named? Okay, that's it, Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. So that is carried. Sorry, I really struggle with this one. I do.
Sorry.
Beth, you need to move on to the next point about the early years budgets. I will let Lindsay respond after you've spoken.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll give a quick summary before we get on to the responses. So we went out to the 5 maintained nursery schools that we have in the West. 2 are in a federation, and we had 4 responses. 3 of those 4 responses, which represents 3 of the 5 maintained nursery settings, were in favour of a redistribution of a supplement that is within the DSG specifically for the maintained nursery settings. That funding is shown separately within our DSG statement in the early years block. And if it wasn't going to our maintained nursery settings, we wouldn't receive it from government. So this is specifically for the MNS, and it doesn't affect the other nursery settings. So we're looking to redistribute this based on an hourly rate per setting. Historically, Camro's setting received more as a children's centre, and Lindsay will be talking more about that in a moment. So it has a significant impact on Camro's in a negative way in terms of reducing their supplement, but increases the supplement for the other 4. We've also received a written statement which the 3 nursery heads would like read out, as well as receiving information from Lindsay. The kind of responses that I had did say that they're not, although they agree with this redistribution, they don't agree with how it has been historically distributed. But 2 of the 3 did want to make clear that they were very worried about the impact that this change would have on Camrose. And 1 suggested doing this in a staged way, that they did still support it, but that they didn't want to destabilise Camrose. So that's my summary of the responses that I've received. So we'll let Lindsay do her representation, but also Peter, we wondered if you would be able to read out the statement from the other 3 nursery heads.
I've got the statement in front of me, so yes, I can read it out, but I want to let Lindsay go first.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So thank you for allowing me to talk today. So I'm not talking as a member, but I'm speaking as an executive head of 2 of the schools that are within the Federation and will be affected by this proposal. I sent through a paper to be shared, but unfortunately this was late in the day yesterday, and I'm conscious not everyone will have had the opportunity to read it. So I wish to refer to this document regarding Camrose Early Years Centre for Children and Families, along with the response that we've provided to the council. To give some of the background for anyone not familiar with Camrose, it is an established integrated family centre in Northampton in the Spencer-Dallington area, and it serves the children and families with a whole range of services and support. There's a service level agreement in place that outlines the expected outcomes for that additional funding that we receive. This additional funding is due to the fact that we're an integrated centre and historically supported families from social care. Firstly, I wish to raise concerns regarding the due diligence process of the consultation. So nursery heads were not made aware of the consultation to redistribute the funds until 10 days into this process, leaving only 5 days to respond. The proposals outlined in the paper will have far-reaching negative consequences on the services and the children and families within the Camrose area. Also, is this process legal? The funding for the family centre was secured by the government when children's centre services ceased. This was to ensure that the only 2 family centres in Northamptonshire, which is Camrose and Pengreen, would be able to establish and secure those family centres. This was in designated schools grant. In 2015, the government agreed the funding could be moved from DSG to the early years block to ensure the funding was secure for the 2 family centres. This was to sit alongside the funding for the maintained nursery schools. We have letters that confirm this. We are currently seeking legal advice and support from our local councillors and MPs. We therefore require additional time to ensure this process is legal, fair and transparent. We also requested whether there could be an extension to this consultation process, but this has been rejected. We believe that until such evidence can be shown, it would be inappropriate for the council to decide on this proposal whilst the legal status of the funding is unconfirmed. If it is shown that the funds are still ring-fenced for Camrose, then they cannot be used in the way that's being proposed today. If the basis of the funding has indeed been changed by the DFE, we would question why this was not consulted on with Camrose prior to this and why we've not received any correspondence. I also wish to raise concerns regarding the approach taken by the local authority with the maintained nursery schools. So just to give you a bit of the background, in February, I was approached by the local authority to support Camrose Early Years Centre, who was due to funding cuts heading towards a very large deficit. A business case and 3-year financial plan was presented in May and approved by Schools Finance and School Improvement members. Within the remit I was provided, I had not been asked to provide a financial plan that would see a further reduction of over £100,000 and the loss of the service level agreement. The 3-year plan was approved by the local authority with no mention of further huge cuts. The centre has recently been through a huge restructure and has seen a large number of highly skilled workforce being made redundant. The centre will not manage a further restructure and be able to retain its services under this council's proposal. Please can the council explain why these cuts were not flagged when the business plan was first proposed? If the funding is now not ring-fenced for Camrose, therefore the service level agreement obsolete, why had we been asked to produce a business case which reflected the work of the service level agreement? The council approved and signed off a 3-year plan for Camrose based on this service level agreement funding for the next 3 years. Therefore, it would be unreasonable and unjustified to reduce the funding. As executive head teacher for nursery schools also in the north of this county, I've received communication from the council that time will be taken to fully understand the implications on any decisions regarding funding in the north, and along with the additional funding for the family centre in the north. They aim to fully consult with each school and understand the implications and considerations for the funding to secure services for children. I wish to raise my concerns also regarding the proposal, which is to remove the funding from Camrose. I'd like to refer to the paper that I've sent to School Forum members on the background of Camrose and the additional services that have been provided for the children and families. There's been no consideration for any of the additional services. I refer back to the paper sent that presents the whole range of services for Camrose, such as family support and early intervention. The impact on successful development of some of the most disadvantaged children in the county continues to grow from Camrose. We work with families on the edge of social services intervention, with families who don't speak English and families with profoundly disabled children and children that enter the care system. Even if funds are proven to no longer be ring-fenced for Camrose, taking away these essential funds from the centre and damaging its ability to support the local community is not the answer to make other maintained nursery schools sustainable. There are other options which could be explored. This would be highly detrimental to outcomes for children in the community around Camrose and does not fit with the council's aim of putting outcomes for children at the heart of their decisions. I also wish to raise concerns regarding the formula that's being used in the proposal to distribute the funds. For years, nursery schools have raised concerns regarding the formula used to calculate funding by central government and requested the council support us with this challenge. But instead, they are proposing to use the same formula to redistribute the funds to the schools. The formula is out of date and does not take into consideration the full offer. The formula proposed is based on pupil data of only children aged 3 and 4. This does not take into consideration any additional services and support that the schools offer. This includes 30-hour funded places, extended places for a 10-hour day, the extended year, places for 2-year-olds, which are the most vulnerable, some of these 2-year-olds, children with SEND and pupil premium. There are huge differences in the context, characteristics and services that are provided in the nursery schools, which none have been considered within this proposal. I wish to raise some concerns with the script for the proposal as well, because it mentions in the script that for over 20 years ago, there were 2 large children's centres in the former Northamptonshire County Council that were both located in the most significant areas of deprivation. Those historical distributions no longer reflect the needs of the current maintained sector. It's simply not true to say that the distributions no longer reflect the needs of the current sector. The high vulnerability and deprivation in the community around Camrose still exists, as it does for Pen Green. So the need still exists for these funds to be given to the school. According to the latest income deprivation in 2019, the Spencer King's Heath area around Camrose is still among the 20 to 30% most deprived of the country. As a federation of 4 nursery schools who sit across the 2 counties, our schools would be treated unfairly by this distribution of funds. Camrose losing funds, Parklands gaining, but no guidance yet as on Croyland and Highfield in the north. This does not create level playing field for the children and families we support and is not based on need and services. Again, this does not fit with the council's stated aim. The table that's been presented on the proposal for the redistribution, in our response, we propose that you can see that in the indicative funding for 22-23 is total of 828,000, which is a difference from this year of 560, therefore an increase of 261 for the West Northampton Council for the nursery schools, including that additional funding that was ring-fenced for Camrose. We propose that Camrose's funding remains the same as it was for 21-22 at 376. This would leave a 267 increase that could then be shared amongst the 4 nursery schools. Therefore, they would all see an increase to their funding, but Camrose's funding would would remain secure. We also feel that both West and North Councils should be exploring further funding streams more fully and working with the sector, Maintain Nursery Schools, to lobby for extra funding from the government to complete a review of Maintain Nursery Schools. We also think there are other options that could be explored. We believe that we should be considering a joint proposal with Northamptonshire Council. The 9 nursery schools have worked together historically, and the funding has come in historically as one council. As like the Children's Trust is working across the authorities, I believe that we could have a joint proposal, consultation, working with the nursery schools, the head teachers and the governors to look at the most appropriate distribution and funding that is required for the 2 family centres and the 7 nursery schools, and that this should be based on historical funding for the service level agreement, deprivation levels, SEND, and additional provisions such as 2-year-olds and the extended day. As a last point to raise, the governors and myself as executive head are extremely disappointed and frustrated that the council would propose such a devastating cut to Camrose funding after we've only just recently restructured the school. It must be obvious to the council that a large cut after having already cut budgets substantially would have far-reaching consequences for Camrose. This makes us question the council's commitment to the future of the schools and the children in that community. Over the last few years, we've been consistently proactive in exploring ways to make our schools sustainable whilst maintaining standards. We've incorporated more schools into the Federation so that we can work together to share costs and best practice, each time adding more workload and complexity to our roles. All of this work and the decisions taken have been for the good of the children and families in Northamptonshire to keep the schools open and delivering the excellent services to the largest possible number of families in the community. We've involved both councils throughout these processes, consulting widely and taking advice at all stages. In many meetings, the council have expressed support for the work we're doing, but the content of this consultation and the way it was shared at the forum and then not being sent to the nursery heads gives a different picture. So in summary, please, I mean, I can send these questions through because really they're for the council to consider. Can the process and decision be delayed so that the legal situation can be confirmed regarding the additional funding to Camrose? Also, can you explain how the characteristics of this area have changed? Can you explain why there was so much expectation on the recent business case and proposal for Camrose was focused on the service level agreement when the planned intentions moving forward was to remove it? Could the process be delayed to allow more time to explore different formulas and considerations? And could it be delayed so that we can work with Northants to ensure a fair process for all 9 nursery schools? And also, can you explain why the formula used is not based on other key factors such as characteristics of the nursery schools? Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure if you send those questions in, because you know, we can't answer them at forum, but I'm sure you will send them in. I'm going to read out the message that was sent from the other 3 of the other maintained nursery schools, just so you've got the full context. So they write, please find below a statement submitted by the head teacher of Wallace Road Nursery School on behalf of 3 maintained nursery schools. West Northants has the privilege of having 5 maintained nursery schools. 3 have been judged good, 2 outstanding by Ofsted. 2 of the nursery schools are part of the Federation. The other 3 have their own governing bodies. All are either in a deficit or heading towards a deficit within the next year. Structures in many of the schools have changed with loss of key staff, such as teachers, and significant staff challenges. 3 maintained nursery schools have been through a redundancy process, and 1 is having to go through a second redundancy process a year later to make a teacher redundant. The pandemic has not helped the financial situation with extra costs for cleaning and PPE. The added loss is falling numbers. Whilst maintained nursery schools remained open during the pandemic, many of us did not implement extra charges due to our offer changing. Private income was lost, and for some, the pandemic resulted in less families accessing funded early education. The additional money received in recognition of the high costs incurred as a maintained nursery school was reduced year on year. However, costs have increased. The head teachers and governors from Gloucester, Wallace Road and White Hills Nursery School welcome the proposal for a fairer funding structure with an increase in the additional money the maintained nursery schools will receive. This proposal will ensure that one maintained nursery school is not in deficit in April 2022, as is the current position, and that a further 2 maintained nursery schools will have a more positive 3-year plan. We also know that the proposal will have a positive impact on one of the maintained nursery schools who are part of the Federation. Leaders of the governors at Gloucester, Wallace Road and White Hills are committed to providing high quality education and care, and have over the years adapted to new initiatives and struggled with decreasing budgets. The 3 nursery schools continue to work with high numbers of vulnerable families, including children with special educational needs and those providing support from social services. We would also add that the maintained nursery schools worked with Northamptonshire County Council by attending meetings and listening to suggestions and advice, including work on the diagnostic tool. And continue to be open to working with West Northants Council. As maintained nursery school heads, we acknowledge that this change has a negative impact on one maintained nursery school, and we would hope that West Northants Council would support that school and ensure that it also achieves sustainability and a balanced budget over time. And that's their report. And Paul, will that go to all members of schools forum?
Can I just come in there, Chair? It may help if I give a summary of what we do from now on in.
Yeah, you can. Wait a minute, Chris. Can I just check that letter will go to schools forum members?
It has already.
Fine. Thank you, Chris. Yes, please.
Yeah, there's been sort of tiny bit of confusion, but which I don't blame anybody about the process here. This is not a matter for schools forum to vote on or determine. This is purely a matter for the council, and is not determined here. It's useful the heads and anybody else involved put their views, but we have agreed that we will meet all of the 4 nursery heads of the 5 nurseries, because one's got a joint head, as you've heard now. We will do that before the end of next week. The local authority that will then make its decision. The governance of this it's the decision delegated to me, not in my current role, but as Director of Children's Services, where I'll be interim from Friday, and Councillor Baker as the lead member for Children's Services. So we have spoken, I think, Beth, to all of the nursery head teachers this morning or yesterday, to say that we will be invited to a meeting next week where we'll discuss all these issues, and the council will make various answers available. The one thing I can say is this is now a matter for West Northamptonshire Council. While we liaise with North, the decision will be taken by West with West DSG resources.
So can I ask a question? Looking at the designated schools allocations for last financial year compared to this financial year, obviously there's that increase this year of over 250,000, and that's, I believe, due to the split in the authorities. So is that funding secure for the West then?
We won't find out the final allocation for West Northants Council until the end of the financial year. The way the funding works is that we find out in the July after the end of March, which is our financial year close. So I can't give you anything other than the indicative figures for what the grant will be. But if we're just redistributing based on hours, and times the protection rate, which the government calculate it, and the basic proposal is to forward the grant on in the way that we receive it, the way it's calculated by government. And as you've sort of talked about, you don't agree with that distribution. But that's the basic proposal. So I can't give you the exact figures, but based on current position, the current grant levels, that's how the distribution would fall if we're just using the hours from censuses.
So really it comes down to the legal stance on this, so whether within that funding there is the legal understanding that that money is additional to the maintained nursery schools for those two centres as family centres.
Well, I think
a proper response to your questions. We'll come back with those.
Yeah.
Can I just clarify then that this extra funding that's coming through is funding that's to be distributed to all of the maintained nurseries within?
No, historically it wasn't. So
but that's historically, this is now though, isn't it?
But it was moved into the early years block to secure it for those two family centres. So it was removed from DSG to make it secure, but now it's being looked at that it can be distributed amongst the others and used.
But
in
that's what government
way.
are saying, that it should be.
No, the government haven't said that, and that's what we need. That's why we're taking legal advice.
The response to our query to the ESFA is that it's the local authority decision how it chooses to distribute.
I don't think we as I think we as Forum have heard what you've all said, and I'm sure the local authority have heard what you've said. Mm-hmm. And from what I understand from Chris, he's going to speak to all the maintained nursery school heads to try and find a way forward. It's not for a Forum decision, but we've noted what you've all said. Is there anybody else that wants to say anything?
Yes.
About this?
Yes, just a clarification. We will listen to representations from all of the nursery heads, and then Councillor Baker and I will make a decision. It is purely our decision, and we will make it after taking representations. And obviously, I'm reasonably secure about the legal position, but we will take legal advice. Beth will pursue that, and we will have it by the time we meet the heads next week.
Thank you. Is there anybody else that wants to say anything on this? I think all I will say, all I want to say, and it's not prejudging anything at all, is that I do think nursery schools, family centres and children's centres make a real positive contribution to children's education. And I'm a very strong supporter of the early years. You know, I think it does make a really positive contribution. And one of the things that's disappointed me in the last few years has been the disappearance of short start centres and children's centres. And I just, you know, that doesn't prejudge whatever decision is made here, but it just, you know, it is, I think that sector is really important in terms of children's education. And I was very pleased my children went to nursery. So,
Chair, before we move on, I just want confirmation from my colleagues that we're not voting on this item. I know there's no binding vote, but
I understand there's no vote on this item.
That's fine, thank you.
Unless anybody wants to correct me. Good, let's move on to item 10, the draft budget consultation, and Emily is going to talk to us about this.
I think just before we move on, somebody had their hand up.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, it was only a very quick one. I won't take any more time up. It was Chris has outlined. Chris, it's the council's decision. It's yours and Councillor Roberts' decision. Would you let us know what that is in due course, since we've invested time in it?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I missed your hand, Paul. It was so difficult doing it on Zoom. Okay, Emily, sorry, item 10.
Yeah, okay. So this is really just to update Schools Forum on the West Northamptonshire draft budget consultation for next financial year. And the medium-term financial plan. So the council is responsible for the setting of its budget as sort of the paper outlines in sort of resourcing a plan to deliver on its vision and priorities. So Cabinet considered the proposed draft budget for next financial year in the medium term, which covers 4 years inclusive of next financial year, on the 21st of December, and that meeting signalled the approval of the draft budget for consultation. So the links to the draft budget papers are included within the Schools Forum paper, but basically just to outline, the council's budget comprises of the general revenue fund, which is financed by council tax, grants, business rates, for example, fees and charges, but then it also it is made up of DSG and public health, which are specific ring fence grant funded areas, the housing revenue account, and also capital, which relates to the capital general fund and the housing revenue account capital as well. So you'll see within the report and the draft budget papers, it outlines the process that we've sort of taken in setting the draft budget and medium-term financial plan for next year. So it's sort of quite similar to what we've done in the DSG budget setting for the high needs block, in terms of we've looked at sort of latest service intelligence and pressures in the system across the council, and taken that latest intelligence to come up with some sort of estimated demand pressures going forwards, and then also savings plans have been worked up as well. So there's been an internal process that's been led by the leader of the council, portfolio holders, the chief exec, the chief financial officer, and the senior leadership team, in terms of scrutinising those budget proposals, and also ensuring that the sort of savings and efficiencies that are put forward are robust and deliverable going forwards. So at the start of the budget setting process, we were sort of facing a gap in the budget, which we are legally required to set a balanced budget. The gap was in the region of 21 million, which represents about 6% of the budget. So sort of through the process of Star Chambers, we've resulted, as you'll see, in a sort of published balanced draft budget. But you'll notice in the papers as well that whilst a sort of balanced budget has been set for next financial year, the medium term still is quite challenging in terms of closing the gap. So the key headlines then, the council budget is approximately 730 million. If you exclude DSG from that, it's approximately 340 million. So the Children and Education Directorate make up about 75 million of that total. So the large proportion of that is the West Northamptonshire's share of the contract sum payment to Northamptonshire Children's Trust, who obviously deliver social care and early help services on behalf of the council. The remaining sort of budget is formed of the local authority, statutory education functions. So you'll see within the budget proposals, as part of the draft budget, there's 2 million investment proposed in children education services, with savings and efficiencies totaling just over £500,000. Of that investment, £1 million relates to education, and it's basically, as outlined in previous forum meetings, where we're seeing a reduction in our central schools services block funding. Basically, the council are investing general funds to ensure that those services don't reduce or are cut. So that makes up about half of the investment, and the remaining investment is additional resources being put into the education, health and care team, so the team that are sort of working on EHCPs. So they're really the key headlines as part of the draft budget in relation to children and education. The timeline sort of as outlined is that we're currently in the middle of the consultation process. So the consultation closes on the 1st of February, and after the end of that consultation, sort of responses will be analysed and they'll be taken into consideration in formulating the final budget, which goes to Cabinet in mid-February. So once it's been through to Cabinet, it then needs to be ratified and signed off by full council, which is on the 24th of February. So really, as I said, the report's just for information purposes, but it's really as well just to sort of encourage everybody in Schools Forum just to sort of have a look at the draft budget and input into the consultation as well. So happy to take any questions again.
Anybody want to ask anything on the draft budget? No? Well, we look forward to, and it becomes a non-draft budget and is there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's move on to item 11, which is the forward plan, which you've got in front of you, I think, on the agenda. Paul, is there anything you need to say about
that? Please, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to check with colleagues, as we were proposing that if there was no business, to cancel the meeting that we have scheduled in March and instead go straight to the May meeting. March usually is a very quiet time. So I'm just looking to my colleagues to confirm the latest on that, as we spoke about it last week.
Yeah, there's no, it looks like we've got no agenda business for March. All the budgets have been rolled by then, and there's nothing really to discuss about the 2023-24 budget at that stage.
Karen, you had your hand up.
That's a long gap not to have feedback on the high needs recovery plan. Could we perhaps have a report shared, if appropriate and if relevant? Otherwise, from February to sort of May, that's quite a few months, isn't it, where progress may have been made?
I can certainly circulate an iteration of that report by the end of March to all members of Schools Forum. For their, of course, Schools Forum itself doesn't have any existence outside the meetings, but individual members of Schools Forum can feed back to me.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Lindsay.
Just really reiterate what Paul said around the maintained nursery schools and what's happening with the funding, because that will have been decided by then as well. If that could be done through email to Schools Forum.
Perhaps if we've got the outcome, it could be emailed out. Is that okay?
Yep.
Chris, is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah,
yep.
Sure.
Yeah, brilliant. Always pleased to cancel a meeting. Always delighted. So,
Chair, I had intended, and I thought I had included the proposed dates for 2022-23, and I can't see them on the agenda. So we'll circulate them to members and send appointments. But just for reference, they will be the 24th of May, the 5th of July, 18th of October, the 13th of December, and the 7th of February. But we'll email those around after this meeting.
Thank you very much. Thank you. But when was the proposed March one going to be, so I can remove it from my diary?
No, that's not on my list.
All right, okay. Don't worry.
I'll tell you very quickly.
It was the 15th, I think.
Yes, it was. Thank you.
Yes, there we are. Oh, that can go. Good. We're away at Stevenage that night, just for your interest. Northampton town. Thought I'd mention that. Anyway, any other business? I haven't been told of any other business. So we're going to be meeting again in May, and hopefully we can meet face to face. Hopefully it'll be and we can meet face to face. So we look forward to doing that. Thank you everybody for your attendance this afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you all in May. Okay.
Yeah, Chair.
Thank you.
Oh, hang on.
One very quick thing. Can I just say a thank you on behalf of everybody to Chris Wickens, because this would have been his last meeting, but he had another urgent priority. In fact, about the SEN. So he's been brilliant with me. Although he's employed by North, of course, we do commission him for a lot of work. And he runs all the admissions. So I just like to place on note my thanks, and I hope Schools Forum members would agree with that as well.
Thank you. Yes, we can record.